From Dusk Till Dawn is one of the most unique cult films of all time. Written by Quentin Tarantino, directed by Robert Rodriguez, and starring Tarantino, George Clooney, Salma Hayek, and Harvey Keitel. Not to mention Danny Trejo, Cheech Marin, and Tom Savini. It was a movie about a couple of bank robbers who take an innocent family hostage to smuggle themselves into Mexico to lay low after a heist. They end up laying low at a bar called the Titty Twister, which just happens to be full of vampires and built on top of an ancient Aztec temple. What starts out as a gritty crime film turns into action horror, even taking elements from zombie films, as the survivors have to make it through the night, combining practical effects, clever writing, and lots of gore and violence. Not to mention Salma Hayek in her prime. I mean, goddamn. What came out after this film, though, wasn't as good. There was a couple of film sequels and a TV series, as well as a video game developed by Game Squad and released in 2001 for Microsoft Windows exclusively. And I bet you never knew this thing even existed, did ya? Well, it does, and I'm sorry I had to be the one to bring it to your attention.
And to think that I got a divorce because my wife aggravated me.
Because this isn't some kind of hidden gem or enjoyable cult classic like the film is. It's an abomination, a horrible creation, and something that should be sent back to the pits of hell. But not before I get to rip it a new one.
Danger ahead!
Now, it's described on the Wikipedia page as a third-person shooter, but honestly it controls much better as a first-person shooter. And it really is actually quite an interesting game in retrospect. I mean, for starters, it's a very similar game to The Suffering. They both take place in prison, both protagonists are inmates on death row, and both games have the option of either first or third-person shooting. They've also both got a whole heap of different monster enemy types as well, like in Dusk Till Dawn you'll take on basic vampires, flying vampires, vampires with shotguns or automatic weapons, vampires with grenade launchers, flamethrowers, and even bigger tank-like vampires. You get your hands on a taser, pistol, shotgun, submachine gun, assault rifle, crossbow, grenade launcher, and a flamethrower.
No more cartridges.
And even get behind a chain gun turret or sniper rifle. And some of these weapons are reminiscent of weapons from the Resident Evil series. The grenade launcher and flamethrower are staples of those games, and the crossbow you get in Dusk Till Dawn is a lot like the bow gun in Resident Evil 2. Considering you're up against vampires, you can also drive a stake through their heart for an instant kill if they're on the ground by pressing the right mouse button by default. Now this is pretty handy because it helps you to conserve ammo, which is something you're going to want to be doing because the game is stingy as hell. But it's also handy because it gives you back 15 or so health points. You're also invulnerable to enemy damage from other enemies when you do this, so stake away.
Another one bites the dust.
But look, I'm making this game sound like it's really not that bad, but that couldn't be further from the truth. So how about I give an abridged summary of what you can expect in the campaign?
No problem.
Sounds good? Well, no it doesn't, but what else are we gonna do?
Finish him off!
So in the game, you're playing as George Clooney's character from the movie Seth Gecko, and you've pleaded guilty to the murders, presumably from the film, and been sent to the maximum security prison known as the Rising Sun, which is a tanker in the middle of the ocean. A prison where every cell has working mirrors and the same 3 or 4 blurry posters of pin-up girls. Anyway, a vampire named Clarence Wilson turns up to free his brother Scott from death row, causing a mutiny and infecting inmates and guards alike in the chaos. What an asshole. Seth manages to break out of his cell and meet up with the prison chaplain Kevin, who gives Seth a wooden stake and sets him off on his merry way with a prison guard named Brad. The plan is to get Seth's fingerprints on file so he can move about the ship freely. After escorting Brad for 5 or 10 minutes, your prints are then on file, and you're sent off like an errand boy to rescue a bunch of mechanics from the lower levels of the ship.
A group of mechanics is stuck there. We have to bring them back.
You move through some similar looking environments for the next 15 minutes, scrounging so much for health and ammo supplies that you start to feel like you're in some kind of survival horror game, before finding the mechanics and escorting them back to the main levels of the ship.
Follow me. Let's go upstairs.
At this point, the plan becomes to escort both the chaplain and the mechanics to the water tanks, so the chaplain can bless it into holy water, allowing the survivors to use the sprinkler system as a weapon. Like, remember that scene from Constantine? Yeah, same thing. And it works like a charm, and then Kevin gives you the task of heading to the medical bay to find supplies. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. What happens next is one of the most bullshit moments in the entire game, where you fight an invisible fucking vampire in the prison showers. This bit alone almost made me quit the game because of how annoying it is, but after expending most of my hard-earned ammo and all of my patience, I finally kill the bitch and move on. The boss fight right after this one is even weirder, and the only way that I can think of describing it is that it's a sexy vampire.
I'm gonna suck you dry.
Never on a first date.
Introduced in a cinematic where Seth just starts to look like he's regretting appearing in this game in the first place. But I struggle to call this one a boss fight because all you're really doing is shooting it whilst all these other vampires just keep spawning in to slow the process down. Anyway, once this asshole is dead, you reunite with the chaplain and the mechanics and help them all to get to the chopper. Now, this is the game's attempt to break things up a fair bit, I guess, and there's a few sequences here where you're using a sniper rifle and just taking out vampires as they spawn in. Once these guys finally manage to escape without so much as a thank you, you're then teamed up with what I guess is the military, and told that you have to put some kind of data disk into a computer on the bridge. But before you do that, a couple of soldiers perform some kind of mating ritual. The next few levels are pretty boring and you're just moving through repetitive environments taking on vampires. At this point though, you get your hands on an assault rifle and some ammo and health becomes a bit more plentiful, so for the time being, things aren't all that bad. And these are the moments when the game is okay. Like, it's not horrible, it's not amazing, it's just okay and totally playable. And if the majority of the game had been like this and just let you run around the ship killing vampires, it might have been alright. Like, you see these small hints of what could have been, a glimpse through a shit-stained window into a room of mediocrity. But they screw it up 10 minutes later, because as you pop that disc into the computer on the bridge, Clarence shows up, knocks you out, and then you wake up with no weapons. I don't understand why Clarence didn't just kill you and be done with it, but who knows.
Kleinfeld betrayed us! Here!
One bullet, and we'll get far with that.
Anyways, you sneak around in the next section to find supplies completely unarmed. It initially goes exactly how you expect it to. Yeah, you pretty much get reamed out. Thankfully though, this shit doesn't last too long and you'll get your hands back on some guns pretty quickly. You then head off on your own for a bit and what follows is probably some of the best areas in the game, simply because it's the few times in the campaign where you don't have to babysit other characters and can just enjoy yourself. It doesn't last long though when you meet up with a demolitions expert named Rodriguez, who Seth calls Betty for some reason. I also like how they just reused her character model from that female soldier you met earlier on. Anyway, never one to turn down an errand, Seth ends up retrieving some explosives for Betty, who, did I mention, has a tramp stamp?
Will you move your ass?
Oh, and it's also worth noting that at this point you come across a weapon that fires CDs, which might sound awesome until you notice they can ricochet back and hit you, and you have no control over their trajectory. After you find the explosives, you then set off with Betty to rescue her buddy Marvin, fighting your way through a vampire strip club.
Now we're gonna have to play it tight.
The plan is then to scuttle the ship, but poor Marvin is killed, leaving only you and Tramp Stamp McGee to head to the engine room and blow the whole thing up. After planting the bombs though, Betty's captured by Clarence and his squad. And you then have to defeat a boss which I'm assuming is supposed to be Scott from the intro, but we're never told. Scott soaks up about 15 grenade launcher rounds before finally buying the farm, and then you're free to hunt down Clarence back at the bridge of the ship. After shooting out a bunch of windows and letting in the coming daylight, Clarence finally goes down like the bitch he is. And Seth is narrowly able to escape the ship before the whole thing blows up. And then the game finally comes to an end after 3 long hours.
Ooh, we just made it.
3 long hours which felt more painful than moving my bowels after a night of Vindaloo curry.
Will you move your ass?
And then you can watch the end credits with photographs of the poor souls who were unlucky enough to work on this thing. It's more like an obituary. And if you've gotten to this point, then you can pat yourself on the back, safe in the knowledge that you're one of only a handful of people in the entire world to ever have gotten this far.
Take that, you bloodsucker.
Now, this isn't the worst FPS game I've ever played, but I gotta say, it's definitely up there. Like, that boss fight against the invisible vampire in the showers, for instance, is probably one of the most horrible things I've ever seen in a video game in recent memory. And there's just nothing fun about it whatsoever. I often had to replay entire levels early on and take a much more reserved approach to combat, because the game's really so stingy with health and ammo supplies that you go dry really quickly. On that note too, I think multiple save files is kind of a must just to make sure you don't end up saving yourself at a point where you're pretty much screwed. Overall though, I think there's two key reasons as to why this whole thing is as bad as it is. So for starters, almost the entire game is an escort quest. You either have to follow someone or someone has to follow you. And even if that's not the case, there's often an NPC that's going to be hanging around in your immediate area. And if during any of these instances these guys die, well, it's game over.
That was not part of the plan.
Escort quests are never fun, and I think about the only time when it's acceptable is when you don't have to worry about their health or ammo supply or their pathfinding. But here it's a royal pain in the ass, and you'll see as many game over screens to being killed by enemies as you will to seeing NPCs get killed by enemies, which is bullshit. Another thing is that when you take damage in this game, you're basically stunned and can't move. Now this is fine against enemies that can only hit you once or twice, but against enemies with automatic weapons, quite often what happens is that you're basically locked in place until they stop firing and reload. And against a group of enemies, that's just pretty much certain death.
Be careful!
When you swap out weapons, there's a second or so delay where all movement stops while the weapon switches, and if you're trying to say move away from an enemy during this time, well, you're basically just giving them free rein to attack you. Even simply moving back and forth, there's a delay as well, because even though you're playing this in first person mode, it's one of those games where it still controls like a third person game, and it has to take into account the movements of your character's torso and legs. Just got to the point where I started saving my game before I entered a room because I never knew whether or not I was going to get ambushed from all sides, then killed before I even knew what hit me. I think there's also a bit of a language barrier thing here as well, like the game's been developed by Game Squad, most of whom I don't think speak English as a first language, and as a result some of the jokes in the cinematics are just outright bad.
Oh yeah? I thought you were General Patton.
It's also not the best looking game either. I mean, it did come out in 2001, which seems like a lifetime ago, but when you look at other games from that same time period, you had things like No One Lives Forever, Quake 3, Serious Sam, and even something like Alien vs Predator 2, and they all just look far superior. I couldn't find any information about what engine this thing runs on, but it looks very similar to the Genesis 3D engine, which was used in ethnic cleansing in those religious games Ominous Horizons and Catechumen. And it would make sense, seeing as that engine would be cheaper to license than something like the Unreal or id Tech engine. But it ain't a good looking game either way, and the lack of decent voice acting and music sure doesn't help it. At least it has working mirrors though. Gotta say though, I was surprised at how easy it was to get this thing running. I only had to download a cracked DXE, which seemed to make the game run fine, albeit not in widescreen. And I only had one crash the entire time I was playing. All up though, this game is just a total piece of shit, and there's far better movie-based games out there.
As Jean-Claude Van Damme would say, I am aware.
So if you've never seen the original movie, then maybe use this video as motivation to go and do that. I feel that making people aware of this game's existence has done more harm than good, and the only solace that I can find in owning a copy of the game is that I made the sacrifice so no one else has to. I wish this game was an actual vampire so I could drive a stake through its heart and watch it turn to dust. As it stands though, I'll just have to make do with it sitting on my shelf and gathering dust instead.